Hello and welcome to another sociology revision video from All Sociology. My name is Ben, and today what I'm going to do is take you through one hell of a video because we're still on the topic of stratification and differentiation. And today what we're going to be looking at is the ways in which gender, sexuality, ethnicity, disability, and age can all be affected by stratification and differentiation. So what I'm going to do, as per usual, is share my screen with you, and you should now see me up there in the top right hand corner and the menu of what we're going to cover today. Now, this is going to be a big video. I imagine, I'm never sure how long these are going to take because I don't script them or anything like that. I just chat. I imagine we're looking at probably an hour for this one because there's so much stuff to get through. So what am I going to cover off with you? I'm going to cover off, first of all, like an overview, and I'm going to look at some of the key themes and inequalities that will exist between these social groups, whether that's genders, sexualities, ethnicities, anyone with disabilities, or different age groups as well. Then I'm going to focus in on the issues that specifically affect different genders and different sexualities, followed by doing the same thing for ethnicity, then doing the same thing for disability. And with disability, there's two ways you can look at disability in society. We've got the medical model and the social model. So I'm going to run through both of those, as well as have a look at some inequalities that can affect some disabled people. We'll take a bit of a butcher's hook at age as well. So particularly here, we're focusing on how we can differentiate, particularly by the oldest and the youngest in society. Then we'll be basically have broken the back of most of it. We'll go through sort of 10 key terms from the video. I have to be quite selective with that because there's a lot of stuff that I'm going to talk about in this video. And then we'll finish off with an exam question and then a recap at the end. So hopefully that's what we'll cover today. Just a quick note from me before I get started, because I always sort of forget to say this at the start. I always sort of say at the end. Please, if you haven't already, go back and have a watch of the previous videos on stratification. So I've done episodes 12, 13, 14, and 15 so far. And if you watch those ones sequentially, that will give you the best possible chance of really understanding this content and really doing as best as you possibly can in your exams, which will be coming out pretty soon, I should imagine. So let's get cracking with today's session. So I'm going to start off with this like overview of issues that can affect these different social groups, and there's lots and lots of overlaps that occur. And by that, what I mean basically is that a lot of the inequalities that affect one particular social group, say gender, will also affect one of another social group, for instance, say ethnicity. Now, if you haven't already, go back and watch the previous video I've done, which is all about social class, because class is so big it needs its video on its own. I've tried where I can to sort of like summarize these issues down in just to one episode. So let's kick off with an overview of what we're actually talking about here. So let's, oh, sorry, go back there. Right. So basically, many of the reasons and the inequalities, so the differences that exist between different genders, sexualities, ethnicities, disabled or non-disabled people, and age groups are broadly the same thing. So there's like a bunch of sort of core ideas that you'll need to know about, because you can apply those to different groups depending on what you're asked about. Now, what's also mentioned here, as I'm mentioning overlaps, is that there's also overlaps with different social groups as well. Now, what I mean by this is that particularly you get particular social groups. Let's take ethnic minorities. Ethnic minorities tend to be poorer and more working class. Women tend to be poorer and more working class, for instance. Disabled people tend to be poorer and more working class. Oh, you get the idea, right? So there's a lot of overlaps that exist, particularly with class. So again, go back and watch that previous video on class. Class is probably the biggest sort of source of differentiation in society, because it kind of affects every type of group of person, not just men, women, gay people, straight people, that kind of thing. Okay. But having said that, there's these sort of like overall themes and inequalities and sources of differentiation between those groups, there are also particular and specific sort of things that you will also need to know about as well. So I'm going to go through those with you when I cut through gender, sexuality, ethnicity, age, and disability as well. Now, like all the way through this, I've been going, oh, there the inequalities overlap. And you might think, what does he mean by inequalities? What I mean by inequalities is stuff like how different groups can be treated unequally in work, in education. So we know already the educational inequalities exist between class groups, between genders. So we know girls do better than boys, between ethnic minorities. So there are certain ethnic groups that do much, much, much better than other ethnic groups, namely sort of Chinese and Indian students, whereas perhaps the white working class, Roma Gypsies, those kind of categories don't do so well. Health inequalities. So there are, for instance, just off the top of my head, women live longer than men. Ethnic minorities tend to get ill more than white people. So there's lots of sort of differences and ways that these groups are treated differently or experience society differently. The media, really what we're getting at with that is like representation of groups. So how are different groups shown in society? How are gay people shown? How are black people shown? How are disabled people shown, how are young people shown, that kind of thing. And also inequalities within crime, and particularly here we're thinking about who's more likely to be victims of crime. So again, we're looking at, just the top of my head, sort of some statistics that I know: men more likely to be victims of crime than women, ethnic minorities far more likely to be victims of discrimination and hate crime than white people, for instance, disabled people the same. So you've got differences there in terms of how different social groups, so genders, sexualities, ethnicities, class groups as well, age, disabilities, can experience inequalities in different areas of social life. Now, what I'm going to do here is just sort of show you an example. I'm going to go through sort of like 8 kind of key inequalities that will basically apply to any of those social groups, no matter what you do. But if I just start off with one, which is discrimination. Now, discrimination, what that means is the unequal treatment of people based on your views about them. So treating people differently just based on your kind of assumptions about them. So if we think about discrimination as a concept, I'm going to show you here like how it kind of works. Within each of those social groups, there's a different type or different kind of term used for the specific type of discrimination against those social groups. So if we're talking about discrimination against women, you'll be talking about misogyny or sexism. If we're talking about discrimination against different people of different sexual identities, you might be talking about homophobia or transphobia. Different ethnic minorities, the term for discrimination against them would be racial discrimination or racism. For age groups, both old and young, the term's going to be ageism. And if you're looking at disability, it's just disability discrimination. So you've got this one concept of discrimination, so treating people differently on the basis of who they are and what social groups they are and what their identity is. But within that, it kind of cuts through, and there are some keywords there that will specifically relate to those certain social groups. So discrimination is treating people differently on the basis of who they are. Prejudice is kind of like the stage before discrimination. So prejudice is a prejudgment of somebody. You come up with an idea based on your preconceptions of that person without even really knowing them. It's kind of related to stereotyping, which I'll look at in a minute. So prejudice is thinking a certain thing about somebody. For instance, that person won't be able to do that job because they are disabled or whatever. And discrimination is then acting on that prejudice. So not giving a disabled person a job because you don't think they can do it. Life chances, I've talked a lot about life chances over the last 4 or 5 videos. Life chances are basically the opportunities and chances you have of being successful in life, whether that be in education, work, health, all of those kind of areas, okay? Representation. So I'm going to talk a fair bit about the media in this episode, because the media can show and portray different groups in particular ways, which then affects how those groups are seen by society. So representation, what we're thinking of, what that really means is shown. How are different groups shown by society? So we'll be thinking about how perhaps different age groups are shown, where how disabled people are shown, those kind of things. Stereotypes. A stereotype is basically, it's linked to prejudice, and it's this idea, I suppose, it's like an exaggerated view of one particular group or one particular person. Again, based on a prejudgment. Often you don't know these people, so you might have an idea in your head about old people, or you might have an idea in your head about young people. Young people are untrustworthy, old people are slow, whatever it might be. Those kind of stereotypes you have about people, that's a form of prejudice, and it can ultimately lead to discrimination. Status, my gosh, we've talked about status a lot. Status is your position in society. It's often based on how you're seen, your occupation. We can talk a lot about different ways that jobs are seen as being more important than others, but ultimately it's how you are seen in society and where you occupy in the social strata. Moral panics. Right, I have covered this one in a previous video on crime and deviance, but I'm going to cover this one again just very briefly now. What a moral panic is, it's a worry that society has about the behavior or activities of certain groups of people. And it's like a concern that people have about society losing its norms and values. So people start to worry about the behavior, for instance, of young groups, let's say about young people in gangs, for instance, or it might be working class people and benefit claimants, those kind of things. Moral panics might concern ethnicity when we look at things like migration. So lots of people are worried about a particular issue, often through its representation in the media. I'll come back to that one shortly. And the final thing that I'm going to sort of mention today that really cuts across all of these different social groups is about laws and policies, and particularly laws and policies that have aimed to create more equality between different social groups. Now, the key one that I'm going to mention a lot probably throughout this episode is going to be the Equality Act of 2010. Why is that the key one? Because it basically affects every single type of social group. Okay, so there are particular social policies and laws that affect particular groups. So we might look at, for instance, the Disability Discrimination Act of 1995, the Race Relations Act of 1965, the Sexual Discrimination Act of, I think that was 1975. You don't need to know all of those particularly, because you can just focus on the Equality Act of 2010, which is like an umbrella law that brought together all of these kind of anti-discrimination equality policies. So there we go. We've got some sort of key ideas, and I'll be coming back to a lot of these throughout, but this is like a really important slide because ultimately the stuff I'm about to go through now is going to go into a lot of detail on things like gender, sexuality, ethnicity, disability, and age. So let's have a look at gender and differentiation. Now, these are kind of key terms that you might use when you are, if you were given a question about why particularly different gender groups are treated differently, so why men and women and others treated differently. By the way, just on this point, I'm not overlooking any issues to do with transgender or anything like that. You just don't need to know them for GCSE. In fact, you don't need to know them for A level. And I suppose, giving it the utmost respect, like I don't want to overcomplicate what is already quite a complicated issue. So don't think I'm being like transphobic or anything like that by leaving it out. Purely, I'm not talking about it because you don't need to know it. And also it kind of overcomplicates what is already quite a complicated issue if you're trying to get your heads around this. Okay, so that's just a note on that. But I've got these 5 key terms: patriarchy, gender discrimination, the glass ceiling, the male gaze, and the crisis of masculinity. You may have come across these before. These are the kinds of words and phrases that you'll need to be using if you get a question on gender and differentiation. So I'm going to bring up basically the definitions of some of these terms here. So patriarchy is the big one, and you've almost certainly come across patriarchy before. Patriarchy just means a male-dominated society. It's a society or elements of society where men have dominance, power, control over women in various different social institutions. So whether that be in the family, so we're thinking about there who gets to make all the decisions, who ultimately gets more power in families, it tends to be men. Education, there are gender differences. Lots of feminists would argue that the education system is still very patriarchal. Crime, for instance, whether we're looking at the representation of women in the Crown Courts, for instance, it's much lower. So feminists would argue that certainly when we come to look at gender, you can't overlook the issue of patriarchy. It's the big concept for feminists. So basically, this leads us on to gender discrimination. So patriarchy is this overarching sort of male-dominated structure that exists in society. The way it kind of pans out, according to feminists and people who discuss gender, is things like gender discrimination. So this is ultimately sexism or misogyny. It's treating people differently and unfavorably based on their gender. So one really good example of this is that even though this should not happen, in the UK, we estimate that women get paid about 15% less than men for doing the same job purely because they are women. Now, that should not be the case. There are laws to protect against this kind of discrimination or this differential treatment of men and women. But we know from studies and from research that actually doing the same jobs, men tend to get paid. If a man got paid basically £100 a day, poor job, but if a man got paid £100 a day for doing a job, women doing that same job would actually end up on about £85 a day. So we've got one good example there of gender discrimination in the workplace. Following on from that, there's also this idea called the glass ceiling. I have mentioned this in a previous video. I can't remember when it was. It was Definitely on my extractive videos. The glass ceiling is like an invisible barrier that prevents women reaching the top jobs or the top positions in society. So like CEOs of companies and stuff like that. So it's this idea that women can work their way up in companies, but that they almost get to a certain point and they can't push through this glass ceiling that exists above them for the real top jobs in society. And that is particularly true if we look at the amount of like CEOs, so chief executive officers, the number one position in like private companies, the vast majority of those are men. We're talking about somewhere between like 85 to 90% of the top 100 companies in the UK, for instance. So really disproportional, because we've got 50% women, 50% men. If it was fair, if it was equal, we would expect to see maybe 50% women at the top, but we don't. Right, the male gaze, really interesting concept, this one, developed by somebody called Laura Mulvey back in the 90s. The male gaze is basically the idea, and it's all related to the media. It's related to the way that most media is shot and produced through the eyes of men. And so it's like, because most men are directors of movies, producers of TV shows, because men occupy those important status-driven positions in the media, whether they're editors of newspapers or whatever else, photographers, most media is produced by men, and the content shown is like what we see through the eyes of a man, what that person expects that other men want to see. So often you'll see overly sexualized images of women in movies, or it might be the classic example is like if you've seen the Transformers movies, like directed by a guy called Michael Bay. Megan Fox isn't, and I like Megan Fox, she's beautiful, but my gosh, the male gaze in those movies with like Megan Fox's butt or Megan Fox's body at various different points is just over the top, and it just doesn't happen the same way for men. So it's a way that women are represented in the media in a way that overly sexualizes them in a way that perhaps men aren't. Now, all of those four concepts are all ultimately related to women and mistreatment of women. I'm going to mention one that's related to the mistreatment of men as well, which is the crisis of masculinity. And over the past sort of like 30 years, really, I suppose since the 1980s, when we went through a period of deindustrialization, where a lot of the factory jobs and traditional jobs that men used to do declined, this is ultimately tied in with the idea that men have lost their place in society. Men no longer have an established identity or a purpose in society like they might have done in the past. So you go back 50 years, think back to like the family unit, men being the traditional breadwinners of families. They're the ones that bring the money home. They're the instrumental role, according to Parsons. But now increasingly, as we've seen like the rise of feminism and the changing role of women going like that, the role of men has gone a little bit like this, because men ultimately, according to this theory of the crisis of masculinity, don't know what their role in life is anymore. If they're not the breadwinners, if they're not the head of the families, what is men's role? And that's leading into particularly things like much higher rates of suicide amongst men than women. So there's 5 key terms there that you might want to think about if you were discussing the relationship between gender and differentiation. On to a related topic is sexuality. By the way, if you're wondering, like, what's the difference between sexuality and gender? Gender is basically the norms and values that you associate with your sex, so being a man or a woman. So what do you associate with being a man versus what do you associate with being a woman? Sexuality is basically who you're sexually attracted to. So are you heterosexual? Are you someone who fancies and is attracted to members of the opposite sex? Are you homosexual? Are you attracted to someone of the same sex? Are you bisexual? Are you attracted to members of both sexes? So there we go. That's the difference between sexuality and gender. Sexuality is ultimately about the history of understanding homosexuality, particularly in Britain. So homosexuality legalized in England and Wales, that should say, in 1967. So before 1967, it was a crime to be gay in any way, shape or form. Now, things have changed quite a lot, so I'm just going to take you through this timeline of the law, because remember, legal issues are one of the key things we want to be thinking about this. If we go forward to the year 2000, so 23 years ago or whatever, this was when the age of consent for having sex was aligned with heterosexual couples. So in the UK, that's age 16. So it was only in the year 2000 that gay people got like a parity of rights with straight people in terms of when they could sleep with their partners. If we move forward another 5 years, a lot of things start to happen very quickly in favor of reducing discrimination and differentiation for sexuality. So 2005 saw the introduction of the Civil Partnership Act. The Civil Partnership Act basically meant that gay people could get married to one another, but they couldn't actually say they're getting married. It gives them exactly the same rights as married people, but they just couldn't call each other necessarily husband or wife and wife in the eyes of the law. In 2010, we had the Equality Act that came through. So the Equality Act, as I mentioned previously, is one law that's like rules all equality laws. And this aims to bring about equality for particular types of people, namely women, different genders, sexualities, disabled people, ethnic minorities, and age groups, so on and so forth. And in 2014, actually the law was introduced in 2013, but came into effect in 2014, allowing gay people to get married for the first time. So we've gone from 1967, excuse me, where homosexuality was completely illegal just before that law was changed, to 2014, when gay people have the same rights as straight people in terms of getting married. So you can see there, just from that little timeline, about how things perhaps have got better for alternative sexualities over the course of the 20th century in Britain, certainly. Now, I'm just going to take a quick sip of coffee, because in addition to knowing and understanding how the law has affected changes in ways we see sexuality, you're also going to need to know a little bit about how the media has affected the way that sexuality has changed. So if we go back to like the bad old days, like 30 years ago or whatever, 30 years ago, who am I kidding, 40 years ago, to the 1980s, there was a very a big sort of issue in the 1980s around AIDS and HIV, which is a disease that can ultimately lead to death and is passed through kind of transmission of blood between people. Now, the AIDS crisis in the 1980s basically saw the media, here's a key word for you, scapegoat homosexuals. So what is scapegoating? Scapegoating is where you blame a individual or a particular group of individuals for a social problem. So in this case, gay people were blamed for the AIDS crisis. Now, it wasn't just gay people who could get AIDS. As I mentioned earlier on, AIDS is kind of passed through swapping blood with people. So this could affect anybody, but it did affect gay people particularly. But it wasn't just down to gay people, but the media were blaming gay people entirely. And what this did was this started to create a moral panic. Remember, if you go back and remember what a moral panic is, it's where society starts to worry about the behavior or activities of a particular social group, and it creates this anxiety around it. So what happened was the media representation of sexuality in the 1980s around the AIDS crisis very much changed people's attitudes to fear homosexuality, to really worry about homosexuals, and to see gay people as something to fear. And that was the result of the media representation of that. And you can see on the right hand side there, there's a newspaper article from the time, from the 1980s. It says Britain threatened by gay virus plague, and that language there is very emotive, and it is encouraging people to be worried of these almost like alien people who can infect others. So that's something the media has done in the past. Now, over the last 40 years, things have got much better, and the media has been very influential in sort of normalizing heterosexuality, normalizing homosexuality, and really sort of championing gay rights and trans rights, supporting equality. So we now have a whole host of gay, bi, trans stars who exist in the media. You know, my example there would be RuPaul from the Drag Race, for instance. You know, it's a show that so many people watch, and it's become very much, the media has very much become sort of like a champion of representation of homosexuals and people of alternative sexualities. So things are getting better in that case. But there is a however. And the big however is this, is that we wouldn't be talking about this if there was no issue at all, if there was no kind of differentiation, if there was no inequality. But there are still massive differences in the life chances, so the opportunities of success that people of different sexualities have in Britain. So we're thinking just one example there, much higher rates of hate crimes and discrimination against homosexual and non-heterosexual people in Britain. So whether you want to think about those in the workplace, crime and deviance, and schools, whether that impacts on the law or the role of the media, all of this stuff is relevant for you here. So we've gone through gender and sexuality, looking at some of the key issues that will affect if you get a question on these. So these are the types of things you want to be writing about. I'm going to take a very quick break, have a quick sip of coffee, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about ethnicity and differentiation. So I realise I say so a lot as well, by the way, so I've got to stop saying that. Ethnicity. You might be sat there thinking, what is ethnicity? Well, ethnicity it's the cultural group that somebody belongs to. Lots of people think ethnicity and race are the same thing. They're not the same thing. Race is just physical features. So like what color skin you've got or what type of hair you've got. But ethnicity includes that, as well as things like your nationality, language, the religion you have, and just generally your culture and way of life that you may have as well. So it's a lot beyond just race. It's not just about what color skin you have, of what, or, what color hair you've got or anything like that. This is a lot deeper than just that. Now, when we think about ethnicity in Britain, really what we want to be thinking about is ethnic minorities and the white majority population. Now, what I mean by ethnic minorities is any cultural group in society that are different to the white majority. And often we refer to ethnic minorities as BME groups or BAME groups or Black minority ethnic groups. It means exactly the same thing as talking about ethnic minorities. So you can use that phrase BME groups if you're talking about anyone other than white people. I thought it might be interesting to have a look at how the breakdown of ethnicity works in the UK. So if you have a look at the pie chart on the right hand side, what I've got there basically is based on the most recent census, which is from 2021, we've got a breakdown there of the UK demography in terms of ethnicity. So 82% of the UK is, I should say Britain, beg your pardon, is white. You've got 9% of it is made up of Asian or British Asian people, 4% made up of Black or Black British people, 3% made up of mixed or multiple identity people. So that might be if your mum is Black and your dad's white, that kind of thing. And then we've got other ethnic groups, which might include people like Chinese, Irish, Roma Gypsy, those kind of things. So ultimately, we've got 82% white people in the UK and 18% Black minority ethnic groups or ethnic minorities. So that's just a bit of an indication as to how that split actually works up. Now, because we've got this quite nice mix, obviously it's nowhere near like half and half or anything like that, but because we have got a nice mix, what we can do is refer to Britain as being a multicultural society. We've got a bunch of different types of people within our society. But the thing that we need to be aware of, and the thing that I'm going to start talking to you about in a minute, is about the inequalities that exist between those ethnic groups, which do affect their life chances. So again, we're going to go back to some of these themes like discrimination, the role of the law, the role of the media, and impacts in terms of in work and employment inequalities and so on and so forth. So how does ethnicity affect life chances? But I'm going to go through like 5 big sort of ways that I would argue that ethnicity could affect someone's life chances. So if you ever get a question about this, these are the types of things you want to be speaking about. So the first one is kind of obvious, but obviously racial discrimination or racism. And this is what I mean by this is like individual people or small groups of people being racist to one another. So ethnic minorities much more likely to be victims of hate crime or discrimination, whether that's verbal abuse, assault in the street, or whether indeed it is a form of kind of racism in terms of lack of opportunities to do certain things, so not getting jobs, etc., etc. So racism, just sort of individual racism. Institutional racism is a much different thing, and it's a much broader and bigger thing. So if racism is just like 1 or 2 people or a group of people being racist to each other, institutional racism is endemic, systematic racism that is embedded within the policies and procedures of different groups, organizations, or institutions in society. It's like racism has seeped into the organization. A great example of an organization who has been proven to be institutionally racist is the Metropolitan Police. So that's the police service in London, very much in the news at the moment. And this all came about as a result of the handling of the murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993. Just a quick bit of background on this. Young black lad, Stephen Lawrence, waiting for a bus in Eltham in South London with his mate in 1993. He was stabbed to death by a gang of white young men. And ultimately, the police didn't handle that case very well. That's me putting that incredibly lightly. The murder took place in 1993. A report came out into the police's handling of that in 1999 called the Macpherson Report, and found that the police had been institutionally racist and had led to the failings in not being able to catch the killers of Stephen from 1993. In fact, the case actually went on. It only actually got closed in 2020 when the police finally decided that no further evidence could come forward. And in the time between 1993, when Stephen was murdered, to 2020, they eventually did arrest as many people as they possibly could. But it took, you know, excuse me, it took basically best part of 30 years to bring the people who killed Stephen Lawrence to justice. And that's why, according to the Macpherson report, the Metropolitan Police in London are institutionally racist. There's a lot more kind of news and stories about that, but that's the kind of the big case that you should be aware of. Right, laws and policies. So any kind of laws that might affect the life chances of ethnic groups. I think the one to focus on here is like immigration policies. So we want to be thinking here about like how it's been harder perhaps for ethnic minorities to migrate and move to the UK in the past. So we had the Immigration Act of, I think that was 1971. Don't quote me on that, but the Immigration Act, I'm going to go for 1971, but if it's not, I'll write it in the comments to this video. Immigration Act 1971 basically restricted people's rights to move to the UK, even if they had rights to move here. For instance, if they had family members already in the UK, they were stopped from doing that. But what we've got now is, again, this has been mentioned in the Equality Act because it just cuts through everything. We've got rights of ethnic minorities are now legally protected by laws like the Equality Act, which should mean that every different social group is treated, you guessed it, with equality. Employment, right. So there is not only massive differences between classes in employment, genders and all that kind of stuff, there's also huge ethnic inequalities as well. So if you look at the statistics, ethnic minorities more than twice as likely to be unemployed than white people, and those who are in work may well experience what we call the ethnicity poverty gap. So ethnicity poverty gap is the same as the gender pay gap. Ethnicity poverty gap, what did I say that for? Ethnicity pay gap, beg your pardon. It's about 23%. So I mentioned earlier that the gender pay gap is somewhere in the region of about 15%. This is almost a quarter, so 23%. So that means basically, if you've got two people doing the same job, a white person will be paid 23% more than someone of a black and minority ethnic background. So for £100 a white person earns, an ethnic minority, quick bit of maths there, will earn about £77 in the same time. It's not fair, is it? This is why we look at these inequalities and we look to right the wrongs of society. Final thing I'm going to mention just briefly is inequalities for ethnic minorities in terms of health. So there are health inequalities that exist between different ethnic groups. Just off the top of my head here, so knowing that South Asian groups, for instance, people from Pakistan, Bangladesh or India, are far more likely to experience heart disease than, for instance, white people or black people. The reason for that is it's all due to culture. And the example I'll always give is about the use of particular foodstuffs when cooking. So using ghee, which is a type of delicious sort of like thick butter, used an awful lot in South Asian cooking. Apparently that's one of the reasons why there are higher rates of heart disease amongst ethnic minorities from the South Asian part of the world. But also when we go back to like a couple of years ago when we had COVID-19, there was lots of talk about the ways in which ethnic minorities were more likely to contract COVID-19 and also have poorer health in general than white people. So I'm not going to go into the reasons as to why that is too much or anything like that, but just to be aware that these inequalities aren't just about money, they're not just about in work or anything like that. We're also talking there about inequalities that are to do with your kind of your cultural lifestyle that can then affect things like your health as well. So I'm going to take a break now. I said so again. We're at about 35 minutes, which ain't too bad, to be honest. It's probably still looking like an hour to get through this video, but we're going to move on to disability, and I'm going to just pop this up in there. So disability is seen in two different ways in society. I'm genuinely worried that I'm going to run out of coffee as well for this video, so I might have to pause it and go down and get another one in a minute. We'll find out. Anyway, let's do disability. Right. So disability. First thing to say before we start worrying about the inequalities and the ways in which life chances can be unequal is to think about the definition of disability. So two ways to look at it. The first way is called the medical model or the medical definition of looking at disability. Now, this is where basically disability or the disabled person is seen as a bad thing, or the disability is seen as a problem for the person who has that disability, right? And the reason it's a problem is because society isn't set up, it's not designed for disabled people. So in this way, what we mean is like disabled people are seen as the problem, or they're seen as someone who needs treatment or pity or a way of being fixed, whether that be through surgery or medication or just being given money through charity. So the medical model of disability is very much the idea that the problem lies with the person who is disabled. We're not necessarily blaming that person, but we're saying that, this is the issue we've got here is that this person, for instance, has a broken leg and they can't get upstairs, for instance. That is the problem. It's not society. Okay. Now, if we look at things the other way, we're now going to focus on the social model. So the social model would say that actually society is the problem, or society is the bad thing because it's not accessible and set up for disabled people. So if we look at disability from the social definition, what we would argue is that it's society that needs to be fixed, not the person. Okay, so we might say, for instance, that we need to make changes in society. We need to include more accessibility. We need to reduce the amount of step access into places. We might look at the needs of the person and what they need in order to access society. So my classic example would be like, if you ever go to the movies, I love going to the movies, you might see when you're seeing what to watch, you might see the letters AD that are written by the movie you're looking at. That AD stands for audio description. And what it means is that movie will be shown in a way that blind and partially sighted people can actually be described that film by putting a headset on. So you can see in the picture there on the bottom right, you've got a couple of partially sighted people at the movies. What they've got is a headset on, and the movie's basically being described to them. So they don't have to see it because it's being described to them as well. And obviously they get all the speech and stuff like that. So two ways of looking at disability: the medical model, where it's basically the disability or the disabled person is the thing that needs to be fixed. So if we fix this person, everything will be fine for them. Like if we give this person a wheelchair, everything will be fine. The social model is that society is the problem. Society needs to be fixed. So it might be looking at, rather than giving people wheelchairs and whatever else, why don't we just make everywhere non-step access so that people can get around a little bit easier? Medical model, the person is the problem, the disability is the issue. Social model, it's society, that's the problem, and that's the thing that needs to be changed. So hopefully that clears that up a little bit for you in terms of what we mean and how we see disability. When it comes to issues that can affect people with disabilities, I'm going to couple these together with issues that might affect people of different age groups as well, not purely because there's a like an automatic correlation or these two are mutually exclusive to each other. It's just because the issues just basically cross and cut over. So if you see in the background here, I've got a bunch of headlines from newspapers from the last couple of years, whether they concern disability or age. So we've got from The Guardian, limited life chances of disabled people in Britain revealed by damning report. From The Independent or The Eye, the push to put everything online excludes pensioners and leaves us all much lonelier. And then from the BBC, they're disabled people being left behind in society, the report finds. So we're just going to have a look at 4 ways that age or disability can affect someone's life chances. You won't be surprised to hear me mention this. So the first way is through prejudice and discrimination. Remember, prejudice, a prejudgment of someone, a thought. Discrimination is acting on that thought. So this could be specifically when we're looking at age, the type of discrimination we're looking at is called ageism. So you are assuming that someone can or can't do certain things because of their age, or you think certain things about people because they are of a particular age, whether that's young or old. And when it comes to disability, we just call it disability discrimination or disability prejudice. We also might want to be aware of the fact that there is massive inequalities between older people, younger people, and disabled people, and the amount of money they have coming in. So income is a big issue. I mentioned at the start of this video about the overlap with class. That is a massive issue here. So disabled people tend to be much poorer, tend to be more likely to live in poverty. When it comes to age as well, you want to be thinking here about the very young in society. So if you're very young, chances are you're not earning a huge amount of money. You'll be on a minimum wage job, so your income's likely to be lower. If you are very old, the likelihood is that you're probably not working anymore, so you're not bringing in that regular income from work. What you get instead is your pension. But if you are only relying on your state pension, your money is going to be pretty damn low because it's not exactly very much. So again, that's going to lead to things like inequalities of poverty, and also employment. People aged over 65 can indeed work. They're allowed to work as much as they want. Only 1 in 10 people aged over 65 do. And when it comes to disabled people, far more likely to be unemployed. And it's not due to them not wanting to have a job, it's possibly due to that discrimination and prejudice that exists within employment. When we think about how these groups are seen in society, what we're thinking ultimately here is about low status. Now, low status is often linked to the job you do. So I've mentioned already, if you're older or if you're just younger or you're disabled, you may be less likely to have a job. You might be more likely to be working in low paid employment. So the way you're going to be seen by society, and arguably the way you might see yourself based on your occupation, is probably going to be lower. This leads to what we call social exclusion, feeling left out, or that you can't take part in various activities. So we've got those headlines there that, you know, disabled people feel left behind in society. Is that because society takes this medical model of disability and sees disabled people as an issue or a problem that needs to be fixed, rather than taking that social model and seeing society as the thing that needs to be fixed? That's a bit of a rhetorical question, but there are lots of ways in which old people, very young people, and disabled people will be excluded from society. So they don't feel that they're a part of it because they're not taking part, or they're not engaged in as much activity, for instance, work, as other people. And as a result of this, what happens is what we call marginalisation. So marginalisation is this feeling like insignificant or feeling left out. It's like this, isn't it? If you've got a page of, have I got one here? Have I got a page? I have got a page. This is what it says. Right, look, I'm going to do some like, I don't know what you call this, like demonstrating or whatever. It's the worst idea I've ever had, but never mind. Right, so you've got a page of paper there. You can see you've got the main bit here where you do your writing. The bit on the sides there is the margin. That's the bit that's unimportant. It's the bit that you don't write in. It's the bit you leave, or that you might even tear off if you are pulling something out of a pad. And think about that when you think about this concept of marginalisation. You don't matter. You're off to the side. You get pushed away. You're not important. Society doesn't want to deal with you, basically. So there's a bunch of things there, all associated with the same thing. And then finally, let's just have a think about the way the media might represent or show different disabled groups. So you want to be thinking about how, if disabled people or older ages appear in TV shows, YouTube channels, movies, that kind of stuff, how are they shown? Are they shown as figures of fun? Are they people to pity? Are they people that have an active, important, functional, status-driven role in society? Have a think about how they're shown, and are the media, for instance, or other people relying on sort of tired stereotypes, you know, that, for instance, disabled people are unable to do certain things, or that old people are slow, or that young people are rude, or whatever it might be in terms of those stereotypes. So they're the sorts of things, keywords in yellow there, that you want to be thinking about if you were to talk about why there is differences in life chances between people of different age groups. And we think of the very old and the very young, and also people who may have disabilities. Don't forget as well, disability, not just necessarily a physical disability, it could be a hidden or mental disability as well. Okay, we are now at about 45 minutes. So can I get this rest of this done in 15 minutes? We'll see. I think I might be able to do it. So 10 key terms from this video. Let's just go through some of the key things that I've been talking about all the way through this, and I'll just recap those for you if you weren't sure what they mean. So prejudice is prejudgment of someone. It's a way of thinking about someone before you actually know them, often negatively. Discrimination is the thing which leads on from prejudice. So prejudice is thinking something about somebody. Discrimination is acting on that prejudice. So a prejudice thought might be people with glasses, or people who don't wear glasses are not very clever. Discrimination might be, I don't give a job to someone who doesn't wear glasses, so they think they're clever. Now, you know what I mean. If you change glasses to skin color or gender or sexuality, you've basically got the idea of it there. Patriarchy is really a feminist term. It describes male domination of society and the way that men control and manage society for their benefit at the expense of women. So again, if you think about that sort of strata that we looked at previously, you've got men at the top, women at the bottom, because men hold more power and control than women. Scapegoating is blaming one particular group for society's problems, often unfairly. So the example I gave earlier was about homosexuals being scapegoated for the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. You could easily use the examples of something like you know, young people all being scapegoated for society's problems, or migrants being scapegoated for levels of crime or something like that. You know, the media often use scapegoating as a way to pinpoint particular social groups. Speaking of the media, the way they represent groups, whether that's different ages, disabilities, ethnicities, genders, or sexualities, or anything else, indeed, will have an impact on how that group is seen by society and how they see themselves as well. So representation very much tied into how people see particular groups. And it's not just in terms of groups that can be represented, but also the behaviors of those groups. So this can sometimes lead to what we call a moral panic. This is where society worries perhaps unnecessarily about a particular issue or behavior, often that's been represented by the media. So for instance, there was a moral panic about the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. There's been moral panics about gangs, about drugs, about all these kind of things, and often very much linked to different social groups. So young people, old people, no, young people, ethnic minorities, different sexualities, those kind of things. Institutional racism, right? So this is a concept very much associated with ethnicity, of course. It's different to just sort of singular or individual racism. Institutional racism, where racism permeates throughout in the entire systems, procedures, and policies of an organization. For example, the Metropolitan Police have been proven to be institutionally racist due to their handling of the Stephen Lawrence murder case in 1993, and that was found to be the case by the Macpherson report, which came out in 1999. Marginalisation, I even used a prop for this. I used a piece of paper to show you that when you are marginalised, you are pushed to the sides of society. You are seen as unimportant or insignificant, or as not really having a role or a function to play as much. Disability, we looked at two ways you can look at disability. We looked at the medical model. The medical model sees the disability as the problem or something that needs to be fixed or pitied or dealt with. The social model sees society as the thing that needs to be fixed or dealt with or changed in some way in order to make things better for disabled people. So medical model, it's the disability is seen as a problem. The social model, it's society's ability to deal with that disability is seen as the problem. And the final concept, just to bring this one in here, is ageism. So ageism is specifically the type of discrimination that is used against people of different age groups. Remember, that can be for particularly young people. It can also be for particularly old people. So ageism is just like you might use racism as racial discrimination, or sexism as gender discrimination. Ageism is the phrase you use specifically for discrimination related to somebody's age. Hooray! We're at the point now where I get to talk to you about exams, exactly the sort of thing I want to be doing. Listen, if you take the EDUCAS GCSE specification, this is exactly going to be related for you. So please listen up, because this may well help you out. Who knows, these questions may well come up in your exam. I don't know anything about that, but these are the sorts of things that you could well be asked about. If you don't take the EDUCAS GCSE, don't worry too much about this, but I'd definitely recommend watching it, because you might learn something about how to answer questions, but your questions in your paper, if you do AQA or any other module, will be different to this. So don't take these all completely as I'm telling them to you. But if you do EDUCAS, then do. Here we go. So, as I've said to you before in previous videos, StratDiff is a massive topic in paper 2. The entire paper 2 is made up of 7 sections. You can see those on the paper on the left-hand side there. But StratDiff, Stratification Differentiation, makes up sections 3, 4, and 5 of that paper, which equals just under half the mark. So 49 marks out of 100 is going to be on stratification and differentiation. The types of questions you will have to answer on this will be anywhere from between 2, 4. There might be an odd 5 marker in there, but you basically answer them pretty much the same way you answer 4 markers, and also 9 mark questions. Now, I'm going to go through with you I could have picked a whole number of different exam questions here. I'm going to go for disability, right? So I've got a question here: explain how having a disability can affect someone's life chances. Now, before I go through this, a couple of things to say. Number one, that word disability could equally be explain how being an ethnic minority can affect someone's life chances, explain how being a woman can affect someone's life chances, explain how being gay can affect someone's life chances, explain how being old. So they could just change that social group in there. But if you remember back to the start of the video, I said there's some overlapping ideas here. So it doesn't really matter what social group they mention. You should, hopefully, if you've been paying attention to this video, have some fairly good things to say about this. So now what you might want to do is just pause the video, have a think, how might I answer that question? If you just want to watch me talk through my answer, that's fine, because I'm going to do that now. But if you want to have a go at this yourself, Take about sort of 4 or 5 minutes to do this. You're looking at about, I don't know, about 5, 6 lines, something like that, and have a go answer that question. But if not, here's mine. So my answer to this question, you've got to look, when you get a 2-mark question, sorry, a 4-mark question, you've got to try and give 2 reasons for something, or 2 things that you mention. You mention each thing and you develop it to get 4 marks. So here's my answer. One way is through social exclusion. That's my first mark I get for saying social exclusion. I need to sort of say what that means now. So disabled people are often marginalised in society, as opportunities for disabled people are limited. I could have probably given an example there, for instance, through work. Perhaps not the best. Second one, in other ways, through discrimination. Studies that disabled people are much more likely to be victims of hate crime, which may affect their confidence in life, e.g. going for a job. Now, I'd say that definitely my second reason there about discrimination is much stronger than my first one, but it's probably just enough to get me 4 out of 4 for that. So I've mentioned 2 different ways. My first way is social exclusion. I've then kind of gone on to talk about how this could marginalize people and limit their opportunities. My second way is discrimination, and I've given the example there of not getting a job if going for a job, for instance. So I've been pretty confident, having been a marker for the example, that would get a 4 out of 4. On a really bad day, that's going to get you 3 out of 4, but you know, what can you do about crotchety examiners? I don't know. There we go. Let's have a look at what we've covered today and just go over a few bits and pieces. So what have I gone through with you today? Let's just run through everything again. I started off by doing an overview. I mentioned that there are some sort of key themes that will cut across any issue related to gender, sexuality, ethnicity, disability, or age. Those things will be, for instance, things like discrimination, prejudice, life chances, representation, stereotypes, status, moral panics, and laws and policies. We had a particular look at issues referring and relating to gender and sexuality. So starting off with gender, I went through things like patriarchy, I went through gender discrimination, the glass ceiling, the male gaze, and the crisis of masculinity. When it came to sexuality, I took you through issues relating to how the laws changed over time, how media representation has affected different sexualities, but to say also that there's still, despite the improvements, there's still problems that occur, and that there's differences in life chances. When it came on to ethnicity, I gave a definition of ethnicity. I talked to you a little bit about what ethnic minorities are, and we had a look at the breakdown of ethnic minorities in the UK. We then considered the ways in which ethnicity might affect someone's life chances. So we considered things like racism, institutional racism, the role of the law and policies, inequalities that exist between employment, as well as inequalities that exist between health. When it came to disability, we looked at the way in which disability can be seen in 2 ways, so the social model and the medical model. And age, I brought together, should I say, age and disability to just mention sort of 4 key ways that might affect your life chances, focusing on prejudice and discrimination, income and employment inequalities and poverty. Try saying that one after only having 1 coffee this morning. Low status, social exclusion and marginalisation. And then finally, the role of media representation and stereotyping. So that basically brings me to the end of this video. And at this point, I'm going to come back. Hello, there we are. And just say thank you very much if you've managed to make it all the way to the end. If you have made it all the way to the end, well done. Massive gold star for you. So that's everything for me. It's taken just under an hour to get through that, and it was a bit of a slog today, but thank you for sticking with me. Next video is coming up. We're going to do the last one on stratification and differentiation, which is going to be on the topic of poverty. So we're going to do a whole video on poverty and deprivation coming up next. In the meantime, if you haven't already, go back and watch those initial strat diff videos, because I'm hoping there'll be something in there to help you out, make things a little bit easier. If you haven't already, go and follow me on all the socials, so Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and all of that jazz. If you would be so kind, you can go and donate a bit of money to me if you want to. So if I've helped you out here and you thought I'd buy that guy a cup of coffee in real life if I met him, you can go and do that. Patreon.com/allsociology. But if you just put a like on this, or you subscribe this, or even if you share, the best thing you can do actually is mention, if you know someone who does sociology, mention to them. If you found this helpful, I guarantee they'll also find it helpful as well. So mention this to them, send them a link. That'd be marvelous. I'm babbling. I'm going to shut up. Until next time, when we come to look at poverty, well done for getting through this. Drop me a comment in the comments if you need anything. Otherwise, I'll catch you next time. See ya.